Welcome back to the show. The EU, as it stands today, is a union of 28 countries of hugely disparate economic levels. And some have questioned whether that's actually a recipe for lower middle-class wages. So is it? That's exactly what my colleague Ed asked Steve Keen, the head of Kingston University's School of Economics, History and Politics, and here's what he had to say.
Yeah, and this is really what's happened. I mean, we've seen, particularly even in Germany, one of the reasons for Germany's apparent economic success is that real wages have been stagnant or falling in Germany for the last 10 or 15 years, which has actually boosted their competitiveness for exporting, but the working class haven't seen the benefit of that. So it's, yeah, that extra mobility is actually, as you're quite right, it's a way of reducing the bargaining power of labour and means labour moves where, where jobs are. But when there aren't many jobs, then there's a downward trajectory for the wages.
And so, I mean, to a certain degree, you could say enlargement was driven by political elites who wanted to see labor somewhat diminished in terms of their bargaining power.
Well, you can see that in terms of what the EU's done about their so-called structural reforms. Whenever I see the word reform, I reach for my figurative revolver in economics. What that means is abolishing trade unions, reducing pensions, cutting back on security, meaning you've got to work longer until you actually receive a pension, all these sorts of things which are meant to just reduce the bargaining power of the working class, because a large part of neoclassical economic theory argues that if this economy is not in perfect equilibrium, it's the fault of either monopolies, and we can't tackle those, they're too tough, or the trade unions. So let's abolish any workers' power, and that'll make the market system work more effectively. It's a mythical world of economics 101, and the EU is a tribute to the disaster of basing your economic policies upon first-year economic thinking.
So given the fact that we do have this 28-country free labor mobility, how do you deal with the middle-class wage issues in countries like Germany, countries like the UK?
In many ways, you've got to reverse that whole emphasis upon cutting wages as being a way of achieving better economic outcomes or of reducing unemployment. Their theory, of course, is unemployment's due to workers are being paid too much. So if you cut wages, you'll improve unemployment. That's the sort of simplistic thinking that they've got, which doesn't look at the feed-through effects of your workers as expenditure vehicles as well as cost items for firms. But what it leaves out, this is the reason it's been such a disaster, mainstream economic theory ignores the banking sector. And they therefore imagine you've got a two-class system of workers and capitalists, and if workers get less, capitalists get more, they can invest more, the economy grows faster. What actually goes on is there's workers, capitalists and bankers, and if you start reducing the amount of money going to workers, it doesn't affect capitalists all that much, it goes across to bankers, and you then get this huge income disparity coming out of it, and cutting the workers' wages will actually amplify the rate of growth of the wealth of the bankers compared to the capitalist, which will be great for the capitalist until such time as they've borrowed so much money that they can't repay it back and we fall into a black hole of debt. That's what's actually happened courtesy of pursuing these policies.
How do you think the UK government should deal with those how should it have dealt with those EU immigration issues at the outset?
Yeah, I mean, the real tough thing here is this has been driven by a whole range of factors that are beyond the control of any particular country, but also exacerbated by many national policies as well. So we have a tendency towards depression in the economic system over the last 50 or 60 years, driven by this rising level of private debt and more money going to speculation than going to productive enterprises. That's a background level. We then have the foolish military interventions, which Britain's been part of, that have destabilised all the old Soviet Union, the Middle East, etc., parts of Africa even, of course Libya, causing where people want to flee the chaos that's been created there by the West, and then you have global warming hitting, which is actually a large pressure that's causing collapse of agricultural systems, particularly in North Africa, which is again pushing people away. And all these factors, when you look at them, you can't blame any of these people for being refugees in this situation. It's insane to remain behind. So they're forced into this, and then the West is wearing the consequences of its own short-sightedness. So to me, it's a sign of the entire direction of policy we've followed has led to breakdown. And now we're saying, how do we stop breakdown affecting us?
Right.
The answer is you don't.
Right. Let me say that the EU, it has interest rates at 0%, and it's taxing deposits at the ECB, obviously to boot, so-called negative interest rates. Now, the Stability and Growth Pact also acts as a check on deficit spending across all of the Eurozone. So basically, there's absolutely no policy space in the EU should another recession occur. Is that something that concerns you?
Absolutely. And this is one reason to get out of the euro. I mean, the European Union is, again, the crash dummy analogy. It's designed to crash dummy on the assumption you won't actually hit the brick wall. Now, it's hit the brick wall already. And we're in an aftermath with an excessive overhang of private debt, which is not what they worry about, which means growth will never be there because people can't use credit as part of demand. So there's all sorts of reasons why this is going to fail. And particularly the negative interest rates are another sign that people in charge of the system do not understand the system itself.
Right. Yeah, and you know, one of my concerns is Italy, because if Italy falls into a recession and Italian banks are under pressure, that would require both budget cuts and bail-ins, ostensibly two things that would be very negative for the Italian economy. And you know, I'm concerned that this would actually be an event of seismic proportions in Europe, given the size of Italy. How should the EU be preparing for that event? And were it to occur, what should the EU do, you know, if Italy gets into trouble?
Everything the opposite of what its current policies are. They should allow the Italians to run a large budget deficit to make up for the decline in the private sector. They should not buy. The whole idea that they should bail in depositors shows they don't understand banking, because if you do that, you eliminate the money supply and cause the economy to fall in size further. So reverse that. No bail-ins of depositors. Finance the banks out, but the banks become nationalised before they then get reorganised and sold back into private ownership. And also, the only thing I think way we can get out of this, the real cause of this whole crisis is the accumulation of private debt that's occurred under all these regimes around the whole world. Use the central bank's capacity to help to create money to cancel private debt and reduce the private debt burden and let the economy get back to where it was in the 1950s and 60s with a low debt burden and therefore plenty of capacity for credit growth. There's absolutely no chance of that being done while order-liberals like Schäuble are dominating the system.
So you're not very optimistic, obviously.
No, it's a question of where the disaster first occurs. Will it occur with France leaving the euro or Italy using the euro? I think it comes down to those two countries, which are both big enough to consider making that exit. And at that stage, then it's just going to be, how do they cope with the chaos?